So these are other characteristics of culture. First characteristic of culture, culture is not biological. Culture is learned. You learn culture as you grow up. There are some examples. I believe your book talks about it at some point, that there was an example of a child that was literally raised by wolves, that was at a young age was abandoned, and they never really became human, even though they were discovered when they're 8 or 9 years old. They never really were able to achieve language in the way that we are if we were small kids and raised with children, or raised around other humans. Culture is absolutely necessary to be a human being. Humans learn culture through the process of enculturation. Now, pay attention to the spelling of enculturation, E-N. Later, I'm going to teach you a word called acculturation, A-U, or A-C rather, acculturation. We are talking about enculturation right now. That is the first culture you learn, the culture you grow up in as a child, because cultural learning is a lot like learning a language. If you get to a certain age, you're never going to be able to enculturate completely into another culture. The same way that if I started learning Korean at the age of 23, I'm never going to be fluent in the sense that someone's going to be able to speak to me and I'll be able to speak to them in Korean and they're going to think that I'm Korean. I will probably always have an accent. And that's because I learned it so young, so old. And a culture is the same way. So the first culture you enter, you are enculturated into. That's the process by learning socially appropriate ways of satisfying basic human biological needs: food, sleep, shelter, companionship, self-defense, sexual gratification. It is important to distinguish between the needs themselves, which are not learned. You don't learn to be hungry. You don't learn to desire sexual gratification at times. Those are biological needs. But the way you go about satisfying those biological drives is cultural. Is that helpful? We're a little short on time, so I'm not going to do this discussion question, but it is worth thinking about. Are human beings the only animal on our planet that have culture? We'll talk about this in your next chapter. But are human beings the only animal that have culture? So enculturation, what was the cultural misunderstanding here? What do you think Bill Gates did wrong? People in Korea were very, very upset about this, particularly what we call netizens, that is internetizens, very, very upset with this handshake when Bill Gates met the then president, now jailed President Park. She's in prison for doing a bunch of illegal stuff when she was president. I think we could learn a lot from South Korea. They jail their presidents when they do that. But what do you think was wrong with this handshake? Anybody see anything?
He has his hand in his pocket.
He has his hand in his pocket. In South Korea, this is so rude. In Korea, you show reverence and respect to the other person. I'm going to try to put my camera down. I would normally do this in person. Somebody who's much higher than you or even similar to you in these formal settings, you would shake their hand using both hands. In less formal situations, the further away your hand gets, you can put your hand at your elbow to meet like a police officer or your doctor or something that somebody is a little bit above you socially. Korea is very socially conscious. I don't know if the United States we necessarily think our doctor is above us, but then like at Starbucks or something, at a grocery store, if you hand them money, it would be very rude to just hand them the money with their hand out like this. You should at least hand them the money like this. This is minimum formality. And so you would never have your hand in your pocket. So Koreans were very upset with him. And this isn't really that deep of culture. This is almost surface level culture. You could have read it in a travel guide before meeting the president of another country, but he didn't. And so, yeah, he made that blunder. I actually met the first lady of South Korea, who was it wasn't her. It's not her first lady. She's married to a man. But I met the first lady of South Korea. And even I had only been in the country for a few weeks, knew that I should shake both of her hands like this. If she even wants to shake hands with me, I learned how to bow. I learned how to do those sorts of things. So you don't do this. They were enculturated differently. So I'm going a little bit faster than I planned just to get through all of this. I'm sorry. The next characteristic of culture is simply that culture is shared. makes the actions of individuals intelligible to others of their society. It enables them to predict how others are most likely to behave in a given circumstance, and it tells them how to react accordingly. So let's say that it's not the pandemic, because this example I used to use when it wasn't a pandemic. Let's say that everybody in our culture agrees that when you meet a new person, you put out your hand and shake their hand. That's pretty standard, right? Before the pandemic. But what if I decided tomorrow that that's not how I meet people? Instead, I kick them in the leg. And so everyone's putting out their hands and shaking my hand, but I'm not doing that. I'm kicking them in the leg. Is that culture? Is my kicking people in the leg now part of American culture? Well, no, because it's not shared. I'm just a weirdo. I'm just a weird, crazy individual that kicks people in the leg. It's unpredictable by other people. They can't predict that if they put out their hand, I'm going to put out their hand. It doesn't communicate to other people. They don't know how to understand it. They might think that I'm trying to be aggressive or a jerk when actually I'm just trying to greet them. Right. So it's not part of culture. I'm just an individual with a strange habit. So culture has to be shared. At the same time, no two people share culture in exactly the same way. No two people share the exact same version of a culture. There are things called subcultures. I am a part of a subculture in the United States called professors. We have our own Facebook groups that you're not allowed into, where we talk about professor stuff and we complain about all of you, not very much. And you probably have your own student groups that you go to that professors aren't allowed into. And it's not just Facebook groups. There are subcultures based on stuff you would think about, like age, gender, class, language, all these things. But there's also other kinds of subgroups. So a subculture that I'm involved with, because I teach global media and I teach kinds of things, that I'm a fan of trash film. Does anybody know what trash film is? Any trash film fans? Okay, so it's a little smaller subculture than I might think. So trash film people, normally in mainstream culture, you try to find a movie that's good, and you hear about good movies, and you go find good movies and you watch them and you enjoy them. Trash film people enjoy the process of finding movies that are terrible and watching them for enjoyment. So anybody ever heard of Sharknado? It's a movie about a tornado that's full of sharks.
Best movie ever. Yes.
Ryan and I share a subculture that is trash film fans. Most of us are film people. We see movies, not everybody, maybe, but many of us watch movies. You're all part of the mainstream film culture. You all watched, I don't know, whatever came out, whatever Marvel movie. But Ryan and I purposefully seek out movies that we heard are terrible and we enjoy them. That's a subculture. And there's many, many subcultures. But at the same time, Ryan and I also know to use our hands to greet people at the handshake. Does that make sense? These examples? Good. Culture is based on symbols, is our next characteristic. So much of human behavior involves symbols. Symbol is just something that stands for something else. Something that stands for something else, that is symbolic of something else. Signs, sounds, emblems, and other things are linked to something else and represent them in some meaningful way. But however, symbols are often arbitrary. There's no reason one symbol should be stood in for another. So for example, a stoplight. Why does red mean stop? Why has our culture decided that the color red will be used in all sorts of different situations to mean stop? It could have just as easily been purple or blue or black with yellow polka dots. It could have been anything. There's nothing about the color red necessarily that is biologically driven or anything like that to mean stop. And in fact, if we all decided tomorrow that blue meant stop, that would be fine as long as everybody got the memo and we all decided. So that means that symbols are arbitrary. Does that make sense? The American flag is somewhat arbitrary. Yes, the stars represent the number of states, but it could have not been stars. It could have been, other things. The stripes could have meant other things, etc. So it's arbitrary. The culture is also material. I'm not going to go into culture as power quite yet. I think that's a little too advanced. But also, as a way to transition, what does this mean in our culture? Tell me some words that come to mind if I stood up in the front of the class and I did this, as these children are doing.
Pledge of Allegiance.
Good. So Pledge of Allegiance, we might think patriotism, love of country, I don't know, working together, these kinds of things. And if I was in class, I would do this with my body. But what if I knelt? What things come to mind? Patriotism, not patriotism, or maybe patriotism, I don't know. The point is that culture is integrated, culture changes. So 20 years ago, this used to be understood pretty much the same exact way by everybody in the culture. But once people started kneeling during the Pledge of Allegiance, during the national anthem, the meaning of this slightly changed, right? Now, maybe you might think this person, and again, please forgive me, these are just examples. You might think maybe that person is slightly racist, right? Maybe they're not, maybe they're just patriotic. And I don't think that. I'm just trying to be very, very open, but it changed the meaning of whatever this means. So culture is integrated as a whole. If you change one part of culture, everything else changes. One symbol changes, other symbols start to change. Now, you don't have to memorize this entire image right here. I don't want you to know all this. I just want you to understand that that social structure is integrated and you can't change one part, which means that culture is dynamic. Oftentimes, we talk about, well, let's not change something about our culture that has been around for hundreds of thousands of years. Well, that would be odd. Almost nothing in our culture has stayed the same. Culture, the weird thing for culture would be for it to stay the same. Culture changes. That's what it does. That is a characteristic of culture. If you ever had a culture that didn't change for any amount of time, that would be the strange thing. So culture is dynamic. Currently, I have this image because currently the culture around the symbol of Civil War monuments is changing. It's contested. Not everybody necessarily agrees what that means. Not everybody agrees with what it means to kneel during the national flag. Some people takes it as an insult to our veterans. Other people take it as an insult to our nation. Other people say, no, I'm doing it for patriotic reasons because I believe we should all be equal. It is currently contested and has changed what other kinds of symbols mean. Do people understand that lesson? I'm choosing a very controversial subject in order to elucidate this as brightly as possible. So please don't, I'm saying some things that people might take offensively. I do not mean it that way. I am trying to just use this as an example. Do people understand the lesson, what I'm trying to get at? Cultures are dynamic systems that respond to motions and actions within and around them. When one element within the system shifts or changes, the entire system strives to adjust, just as it does when an outside force applies pressure. To function adequately, a culture must be flexible enough to allow such adjustments in the face of unstable or changing circumstances. So again, if culture is predictable, it is predictably dynamic. It will always change. How are we doing? Well, we only have about 5 minutes left. And the rest of the lecture gets into a little bit about consumerism, but I don't want to bring up consumerism with so little time left. So does anybody have any questions about the lesson? Why did we play a bathroom game? Hopefully everybody understands the applicability of some of these. Again, I pick controversial subjects and toilet humor because I think it gets people's attention. I hope it wasn't offensive.